All right. This is chapter 14 on education. There are three parts. So we are beginning with part one. And part one is just a um, focus on our primary terminology, discussing the distinctions between the problems that we see in highly industrialized countries versus countries that have undergone less industrialization, how those educational problems that we see differ. We'll talk a little bit about the structure of the American schooling system. And talk a little bit about the history of education as a social institution in America, and before setting the stage for part two, which is going to focus explicitly on some of those education related problems. And then part three will provide like some kind of final takeaway observations about education in America, as well as a very brief discussion of those theoretical frameworks and political ideologies. So beginning with our kind of primary definitions here. So education, as I already indicated, is a social institution, and it's a social institution by which society transmits knowledge to its members. And by knowledge, this can include everything from society's norms and values to like your actual kind of knowledge base. And this isn't Education isn't the only social institution in which learning takes place, because you can learn in a variety of ways. Kind of what makes the institution of education unique is the fact that the expectation is that the bulk of this learning is going to rely upon direct instruction, right? So it's not like role modeling and it's not like observation. It's the idea that you are going to be taught these things. And, you know, if education is occurring through this direct instruction, it doesn't necessarily have to take place solely within the schools. Families and communities can also be sites of education. Your job, if they're teaching you something through direct instruction, can be a site of education. Now, when the education is occurring in academic institutions like schools, we call that formal education. And formal education did become, at least in the United States, increasingly common with industrialization. And we'll talk more about that on later slides. Now, when formal education or formal schooling is extended to a wider segment of the population, we call that mass education. And that's because the first educational institutions, that were created in the United States. So not just, the learning that was taking place in people's homes by them having like private tutors or anything like that, but the actual kind of first educational institutions, they were created by Puritans for religious studies, and they were predominantly all attended by white men of a certain means. Mass education, of course, is the extension of formal education beyond that limited kind of population segment. And then the final term is public education. And this is where you have a universal education system that's provided by the government, funded by tax revenues rather than student fees. So when mass education is now funded by the government and students and their families do not have to directly pay for that education, we refer to that as being public education. So what this looks like in the United States, like our school system structure, our formal education structure, can kind of be split into grade levels. First, you have your pre-primary. This could be everything from daycare to preschool to pre-kindergarten programs. Children attend these types of programs in schools up until about the age of 4 or 5. In most areas, this is not compulsory, meaning they are not required to attend. So there are some students, some young people who, never receive this kind of pre-primary schooling. There has been policy debates about whether or not pre-K should become compulsory. And there certainly have been states that have kind of played around with the idea of making pre-K kind of a part of primary education, which brings us now to that primary level. Typically, this is grades K through 5, so that's ages 5 to 11. If you are not going to enroll your child in primary school, states have different requirements about, their homeschooling and what that does require. And in some cases, you could perhaps delay the start of attendance by a year or two. But at some point, because we have public education and it is compulsory that students attend, someone will be looking to see, is your child enrolled in school? Then we come to what's called middle or secondary, and it's split in 2 levels. There is what we call middle school or junior high. And middle schools are traditionally grades 6 through 8. And junior highs were traditionally grades 7 through 9, with that 6th grade still being part of your primary elementary school. There are some junior highs still in existence, but it's worth noting that a lot of states, counties have switched to the middle school model. And a lot of that has to do with kind of increasing college enrollments and colleges requiring a certain number of years of high school math and English in particular. And in order to make that happen, there needed to be that additional year of high school. So for a lot of us, what high school looks like is grades 9 through 12. And, to the extent this is where it possibly stops being compulsory. Different states have a legal age at which you are allowed to withdraw from school. Some states it's at 16, but there have been some states that have been pushing that age up to 18 just to try to discourage people from dropping out. Post-secondary is never compulsory, kind of like pre-primary, in the sense that, it's the choice. Now it's the choice of the student themselves because they are an adult. But the systems that make up the post-secondary system would be like your community college / 2-year colleges, where you can go either with the expectation that you will be transferring to a 4-year at some point, or to earn a specific degree, what we call an associate's degree, or in a lot of cases, especially for community colleges, there's a variety of trades programs and trade certifications that you can earn there. And then, of course, we also have our 4-year colleges and universities. Post-secondary is also comprised of a graduate professional level. So this is after you complete your BA. You can perhaps, for your job, it requires you to get a professional degree. This would be something like a JD or MD if you're interested in becoming an attorney or a doctor. Graduate school gives out MAs, MSs, master's degrees, as well as doctorates. For all the post-secondaries, particularly the 4-year and the graduate college and professional, this is a tiered system. And we'll come back to that discussion when we talk about credentialism. But it's the idea that there are some schools that are considered to be higher ranked. They have more status. Those schools, the Ivy League, elite colleges, what you sometimes hear people refer to as your big state Ivies, like, UNC Chapel Hill, UVA, UCLA. But it's worth noting that the credential that you get from these schools is the same credential that you would get at a smaller school or a less well-known college. The BA, the certificate is the same, but kind of the awareness and the status associated with the institution can differ. As you can kind of see in that graph, we had a dramatic increase in the number of people graduating from high school in the decades after World War II. And it was also during that time period that we have started to see a kind of steady increase in the percentage of people who are graduating from college, now rising up to being about 1/3 of the population. And so, before we get into kind of a intense focus on the problems that we have in the US educational system, um, let's just kind of compare that to the problems that other countries have, if we take a global perspective. So low income countries, most of which of course are some of the least industrialized countries, their a lot of their problems related to education can be summed up by the kind of too little schooling. um, Although all nations provide for primary education for at least some children, in a lot of these really poor nations, a lot of children don't go to school. And when you start talking about secondary education, it becomes even less common. Oftentimes, this is very gendered, where because of patriarchal views, males often have greater opportunities, and young women are less likely to have educational opportunities, or to be able to take advantage of the educational opportunities that do exist. A lot of these nations are more agrarian and rural. Like I said, they are some of the least industrialized. And because they're still relying on farming and other types of kind of work with the land, the family still operates a lot like how families operated in the United States 150 years ago, right? Where it's a primary economic unit, and the young people in the family are essentially workers. And so this has been a problem because the children are expected to work at an early age and contribute, and schooling, of course, takes away from their ability to do that. So this has been an issue that governments in poor nations have kind of faced. And one reason why they realize it's such a problem is because oftentimes these countries have very low literacy rates, and literacy is important for economic development. It will be very hard for them to kind of compete in a world that's already post-industrial. We talked about in the work chapter the fact that America has been we're not even in the industrial age, we're in the information age. You can't really compete in that type of society, with that type of economic system, if your country has really low literacy rates. And your book gives you a map that just kind of points out, the places in the world where the percentage of people that are illiterate is very high. So those areas that you see that are kind of dark green, in those countries, it's over 50%. In those areas that are kind of like a medium shade of green, it is like 20% to right under 50%. So that is a sizable chunk of your adult population, compared to the countries you see, of which like America is one, Canada, Russia, Australia, most of Europe. You see that it's like less than 2% of the adult population is considered to be illiterate. And so this is why in those low income countries, the major issues related to schooling are issues kind of related to how do we extend schooling, right? How do we get to this point where we have mass education, public mass education at that? Um, Before we get into the problems that high income countries are more apt to face, let me just make a quick point about literacy. Your book talks about functional illiteracy later in the chapter, where there's talking explicitly about problems, education related problems that the United States has. And just for the sake of the flow of my slides, I just wanted to put that information here while we're already talking about literacy, because I said that America has, less than 2% illiteracy rates percentage. But when you read that part of your chapter, in terms of functional illiteracy, meaning people can't necessarily read or write very well, but they're able to do kind of some very basic arithmetic functions. Maybe they have some small recognition of some words. Maybe they can write maybe their name. but they can't, spell much else, right? They can do enough to get by. So we call that functional illiteracy. And it's worth noting that that is much higher in America. It's about 17% or more of the US population um, that kind of are functional illiterates. Um, and obviously this affects your job opportunities in a lot of ways. It affects your ability to even apply for jobs, and because this is seen as being stigmatizing, it's a source of embarrassment and shame. Functional literacy is more likely to exist in rural areas as well as urban areas, but predominantly in communities that are lower income, and especially among older people who have spent their whole lives kind of being lower income. And it has a lot to do with kind of quality of education that was available to them at the time that they were children, and the fact that our public education system, particularly for racial minorities, was had even more problems back then than they do today. Which leads us now to talking about what are the problems that exist in a high income country. Well, the issue here isn't so much that it's too little schooling, but what your book notes is being unequal schooling, because there are higher rates of schooling and literacy in these countries. And that's important because in these countries, education is a necessity for jobs, and post-secondary education has even become much more of a necessity for these jobs. And therefore, post-secondary education has been made available to a larger share of the population compared to low income countries. So it's not just that we provide public mass education, primary and secondary. And post-secondary, while not compulsory and while not free, right? College is not free. It has become much more accessible than it has in the past. And that's because in a higher income nation, especially one like the US, we are what is called a credential society, one in which the access to desirable jobs and social status depends on the possession of a certificate or diploma certifying completion of formal education. So it's not even necessarily that you learn the skills that you need for certain jobs in your college programs, so much as certain jobs have just been set aside for people who have college degrees. And if you talk to older people in your family, they maybe remember a time when certain jobs, a college degree wasn't necessary, because it was like, hey, we can teach you what you need to know on the job itself. But now, of course, those jobs require a college degree, not because the work itself so much has changed, but because we have really moved in becoming a society where we put credentials on a pedestal, right? It's a status issue. And if you think back to when we talked about social class as being not just about your occupation or your wealth or your income, but also kind of this like prestige. That prestige comes from the credential that you hold. And so your degree serves as a filter, determining jobs and promotions, right? There's some jobs, some positions in your company you can't move to if you don't have an advanced degree. Has nothing to do with your ability to know the job or do the job well. And so in this way, these credentials, they shape the opportunities for social and economic mobility. And in this way, it contributes to the kind of like ongoing stratification of people into existing, classes and social hierarchies, right? So this is the way in which we make distinctions between the lower middle class and the upper middle class, beyond just how much money do they make at their job, but also this sense of like, what type of credential have they earned? Because there are plenty of people that don't go to college and earn more than a teacher with a master's degree, but larger society, because we are a credential society, will probably come to kind of will have different types of stereotypes and different types of kind of preconceived notions when comparing that teacher with a master's degree versus, a person that didn't, go to college but makes roughly that same amount of money. And it's because of kind of the pedestal that we put credentials on. And we see that, of course, when we look at even money, because although you don't have to go to college to earn money, there is a relationship between education and income, where the more education you have, in most cases, in a lot of cases, the more money you are likely to make on average. And this holds true despite the gender gap between men and women. And it holds true despite the gender gap that exists between men and women of different racial ethnic backgrounds. The kind of easy summary to make is that in most cases, having more education in a credential society means that you are going to make more money than a person like you, meaning a person that shares your gender and racial ethnic status, who does not have that degree or has a lesser credential. And so how did we get here? Brief word about the history of mass education in the United States. And that'll be it for this part one. From the very beginning, some of our founding fathers, felt like education was key to making the U.S. a democracy, because at that time, even though they were only talking about white male property owners being voters, still that was unique compared to how most other countries were run at that time. And so if you're going to have a country that depends on the kind of average person casting their vote, participating in the political process, you want that person to have a certain level of understanding of the world. And so for Thomas Jefferson, he felt like literacy was really important, although, of course, because it did reflect the people that made up the voting base. At first, education was largely limited. Formal education was largely limited to white males. And usually that did not include poor white males either. As industrialization progressed and fewer people made their living from farming, formal education came to be regarded as being essential to the well-being of society. And it started to be seen that way, not just for men, but for women, and not just for whites, but for racial ethnic minorities. By 1918, it was mandatory that people at least stay in school through the 8th grade. Although, of course, states did differ on how well they kind of upheld this mandatory statute. But you can see that if you're just kind of looking at that high school and college, graduation rates, as we've already discussed, high school graduations has steadily increased. College graduation has also steadily increased. So we have become a country where formal education and mass education is really key to our economic progress and well-being. That does not mean that just because education is available and education is expected, that public education doesn't have problems. As your book notes, public education has many problems. So the point of video 2 is going to be answering this question: what are the problems associated with the U.S. high school system, or the U.S. school system, and how do they relate to inequities in larger society?